Today's pre-conference webinar is titled, Be Ready for What's Coming Next in Innovation in Animal Ag. U.S. agriculture is under the microscope as those in the food supply chain look to farmers and ranchers to help them meet ambitious global sustainability and ESG goals. Technology and innovation will be critical for animal ag to rise to the challenge. However, several obstacles to progress loom. In this session, experts will consider possible solutions to these challenges and how we can both fund and earn consumer acceptance for innovations that will shape the future of animal agriculture. Today's speakers are J.J. Jones, who is the Executive Director at the National Institute for Animal Agriculture, and Amy Teplata Church, the Engagement Specialist at the Center for Food Integrity. Now, before I turn things over to today's panelists, I do have a poll question for you. And today's poll question is, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to consumer acceptance of innovation in animal agriculture? Is it lack of understanding, ethical concerns, food safety concerns, desire for natural products, or something else? And if you select something else, please do share your answer in the chat with us. All right, let's see what the answers are. So 74% of you said lack of understanding, followed by ethical concerns. So I will kick it off to today's panelists. First speaking is J.J. Jones. So take it away, J.J.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Casey, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on which time zone you are in and where you are located. As Casey mentioned, my name is J.J. Jones, and I'm with the National Institute for Animal Agriculture. And for those not familiar with our organization, since 1916, the National Institute for Animal Agriculture has convened animal agriculture leaders and allies in various settings to explore and discuss, learn, and then develop solutions that move interdisciplinary cooperation forward for all of animal agriculture's progress and continuous improvement. And I've borrowed the description that Hannah actually described of how our two organizations work together on many occasions. And that is that while NIAA is behind the scenes, convening and discussing, learning, and exploring, the information or those collaborations that we identify are then used for organizations like the Animal Ag Alliance or checkoff organizations or animal agriculture trade associations, as you all engage with various audiences in a more public manner in front of the curtain or on the stage. So we like to think that we can play that role in supporting kind of behind the scenes. So we'll talk about an initiative that we've been working on that played nicely into today's conversation, which is to increase awareness and to further explore how do we attract greater innovation and technology within animal agriculture, and why that's important from our standpoint as we've visited with various leaders across our sector of the food system. So I've entitled today's conversation, What is Animal Agriculture's BHAG? And BHAG, for those not familiar, is an acronym, I believe, first coined by Jim Collins in his book, Built to Last, a number of years ago. And the acronym stands for Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. And we'll talk in just a few minutes about why a BHAG is so important in conversations across the food system. And so with that, I want to also remind you that I too have a poll question that I will be asking you in just a moment. But then I also have a space where I'm going to ask you to enter your feedback or your comments in the chat feature. So you might get ready, as Casey mentioned, to have your chat feature ready and open when needed. A little bit about myself. I like to say I'm a realistic opportunist. And what I mean by that is, like many of you, I see several friends and new faces in the participant list. I grew up on a farm and ranch in Western Kansas. That photo on your left of the screen is what I call my first show steer. He was delicious. That's my humor. Hopefully you're laughing where you're sitting. But anyway, throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work in animal agriculture all around the globe, and I've really enjoyed working with animal agriculture and those of us who believe that animal agriculture is such a vital part, not only of our food system, but society at large, of how we empower people to make a living, how we empower people to rise up out of poverty. And obviously we're doing that while providing meat, milk, eggs, seafood, and fiber to a growing world. So that's just a little bit about who I am. So this is my first poll question. This is like the pop quiz that your teacher might have given you. The answer was in the description of this session. But in 2019, how many dollars did venture capital firms invest in food and ag tech? Was it 950 million, 19.8 billion, 35 billion, or 40.7 billion? So just as Casey did, I will give you just a couple moments to make your selection. Again, this was for calendar year 2019. How many dollars flowed into food and ag tech? So whether that's at the farm and ranch level or on through production and processing to even those consumer facing products that you and I might find on a grocery store shelf or in a restaurant or other food service establishment. Good. 43% of you had the correct answer. So, and we'll talk about this in more detail again in just a few minutes. But in 2019 alone, this is when many of us in this space started really seeing the significant advancement in investment in the food and ag tech space. And so in 2019 alone, there was just over $19.8 billion invested throughout the value chain. Now, keep in mind too, these are only the dollars that were publicly discussed. So there may have been private investments that happened that were not issued in a press release or did not flow through a channel where we could find that information. So I think it's safe to say that we can ascertain there was over 19.8 billion invested, but that's a fairly large and significant investment that's taking place. So I am, as a realistic opportunist, someone who's driven by data and information. I think if you put data points together, you start to find a story that's being told. And so for our conversation today, there's a few numbers that I'd like you to write down or jot down and remember. The first one is that $19.8 billion. So we'll talk about why that is so significant. 90% is the other number I'd like you to write down, followed by $7.6 billion. And then the fourth number is greater than $51 billion. So those are four numbers that I think you'll want to write down. So before we dive into each of these individual numbers, several months ago, I was at a convening where the speaker shared a sentiment of goals drive culture. And this really resonated with me because I feel that's where animal agriculture and the food system, which of course we're a vital part of, is at today. That there are goals being set by various organizations and groups that are really driving the culture across the United States and around the world when it comes to various aspects of our food system. So I'm a big believer in words have meaning. And so I checked out Merriam-Webster's dictionary to find the definition of culture, which I've put up there on the screen. And, you know, that first section of the definition really resonated with me, that culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. So the culture then, and I know Amy will discuss this even in greater detail, is the set of values or conventions and social practices associated with a particular field, like food or animal agriculture, activity, or societal characteristic. And then we think about a BHAG. And like I mentioned, this was first introduced by Jim Collins several years ago. And the idea behind a big, hairy, audacious goal is that it's a clear, compelling target for an organization or a culture to strive for. So we've probably all heard that we should set SMART goals. Well, BHAGs aren't really SMART goals. They may never actually be attainable, but because they are so clear and compelling, we as a group of people or as an organization, we want to move towards that BHAG because it is compelling us towards a culture that we desire. Back to goals drive culture. So when I think about it, though, it's safe to say that animal agriculture as a sector of the food system is definitely a mature industry sector. We've been around for millennia. We are trusted within the food system in many cases. However, because of our maturity and where we're at on the maturity curve, I would ask, what is our BHAG? Because what's happening over the last few years is we see other alternative proteins coming to the market that I would argue have a very compelling BHAG. While each individual organization's BHAG may be unique or similar or unique to its entity, if you look at just the top four that I've selected in terms of investment from the last few years, I'll let you read those and you can start to see a unified message in terms of a big, hairy, audacious goal. And to sum it up in my mind, their big, hairy, audacious goal is really to replace animal agriculture in terms of a protein of choice, or in some cases, even as the supplier of protein in terms of human nutrition and health. And so that leads us into why innovation and technology is so important within animal agriculture if we are going to have a BHAG of our own. Because I would propose that over the last several years or decades, because we've been the protein of choice, animal agriculture has, our goals have been more those SMART goals. We've looked at topics like greater productivity. How do we ensure that we are supplying protein not only to our friends and family and neighbors here in the United States or our region of the US, but across the globe? We've looked at goals around preserving lifestyles. How do we ensure that the next generation of family members or business owners can take over our sector of animal agriculture? And really then in terms of certain proteins, species specific, for example, our goal has been, how do we compete with other species proteins? So in a previous life, I worked in the beef industry sector. So obviously we looked at how do we ensure that beef is on the plate in conjunction with or in a higher proportion to poultry or fish or pork, et cetera, et cetera. And if we think about mature industries, they become ripe for disruption. And that's why a BHAG, or a big, hairy, audacious goal, is so important. And when I think about industries that have been disrupted significantly, just a few this morning came to mind, or, obviously I've reflected on them before, but the three I wrote down as I was preparing my notes for today are, think about Blockbuster. Blockbuster was at the pinnacle in terms of how entertainment was assessed or accessed, not assessed, but accessed by many of us. We would go to our corner Blockbuster store and rent a tape or a DVD, but where is Blockbuster today? You think about some of us who grew up playing Atari or Nintendo, and where are those companies today in terms of their market share and how they've been disrupted? And if we even look at the food system, another sector of the food system I would propose had a significant disruption in the last decade plus is the wheat or flour-based foods space. So whether it had to do with decreasing the amount of carbohydrates someone's consuming in their diet, or it had to do with health concerns over gluten sensitivities or celiac or other diseases, there are quite a few examples of companies both within food and agriculture and outside that if they didn't have that compelling goal that drives their culture forward, they were disrupted. So here's where I'd like you to enter some comments in the chat. Here's my question. What is the last significant innovation you recall that disrupted animal agriculture? So whether it's at the farm and ranch level, in processing or allied industry, or closer to the consumer, what would you say the last significant innovation was that disrupted animal agriculture as a sector of today's food system? So pull up your chats, type in what you think it is. Obviously, in my book, there's no right or wrong answer, but I'd love to get this group of experts' feelings on what it is. Oh, okay, there's my good friend Jenny. Thank goodness for friends online. So Jenny types in Temple Grandin's animal handling philosophies and teachings. I would definitely agree that several years ago, if not decades ago, Dr. Grandin proposed new ways of handling livestock and started teaching those to farmers and ranchers and veterinarians and others. So thank you, Jenny. Who else has an innovation that disrupted animal agriculture? Okay, I see some there. Let me scroll correctly. Genetic stock improvement. Yes. I would tie in when, for example, an organization like U.S. Premium Beef started providing information back from the processing facility to farmers and ranchers and genetics companies and others. We started to see significant improvement in genetics. The same is true in the pork and other sectors, poultry obviously too. Plant-based replacements for animal protein. So that's obviously, yes, an innovation that disrupted us. We didn't disrupt ourselves, but it disrupted us. Kim Kircher, another good friend. From a food point of view, I'd say meal solutions, ready-to-eat kits, and just that makes it easier for people to enjoy different meals with culinary confidence. Another great one. We've got another plant and meat-based alternatives, beta Agnes. So, of course, on the animal health side or production side, yes, that was a tool that disrupted the way we traditionally fed or raised livestock. We've got ethanol and DDGs, and several others. So we have some examples. Now, if we were to be in a room, I think it would be a fascinating conversation to think about on a spectrum of disruption and innovation. If we were to put them on a scale of 1 to 10, and we said, that something like a plant-based alternative or a cell-cultured meat is a 10, where do those others fall into place? But at any rate, I think it's good for us to always be thinking about what is the latest innovation? How are we disrupting ourselves so that animal agriculture continues to be the protein of choice in consumers' diets and on their plate? So let's talk more about these venture capital numbers. I mentioned that in 2019, we really saw a significant increase by venture capitalists in terms of their interest in the food and agri-tech space. So when they start looking at where to invest, there's 6 primary factors that venture capitalists are looking for that I've been working with over the last several years. The first is character and capacity of the founders or the entrepreneurs. So obviously they want to make sure that their investment is going to be sound. Do they feel that the integrity, the trust of those founders or entrepreneurs aligns with where the venture capital firm's investment thesis is? And then obviously they're looking at capacity. Do they have the technical skills, the knowledge, the background in the space that they are disrupting or they are bringing innovation and technology to? They're also looking at creativity. Is it a solution that is actually being sought, or is it a solution in search of a problem? And I think that's also important for us in food and agriculture, no matter where we are at in the supply chain or the value chain, to think about how do we help entrepreneurs and innovators identify where we need creative solutions. They're also looking at the societal benefit. And, we talk about sustainability having not only an economic and environmental impact, but a societal impact. So is this innovation or technology good for the community? In Casey's earlier poll about innovation and technology, one of the options was ethical concerns. And so to me, this is where those concerns would fall into the equation or the conversation is, can we overcome any ethical concerns by demonstrating that this is best for a community, whether that's humans, animals, or the planet? Investors are also looking for sustainable or long-term plays. So it can't just be a flash in the pan type activity or innovation. It has to be one that has long-term viability so that they can find their return on investment, because obviously that's what venture capital is going for. And then in the same terms, what is the financial outlook? Is the growth rate there for this innovation or this technology? And I bring these up because I would propose the numbers I'm getting ready to share with you demonstrate that venture capitalists and others in this innovation and technology space are very interested in the food and ag tech space for all of these reasons. So as we discussed in 2019, there was just over $19.8 billion invested in food and agri-tech across the supply chain. Now, of that, though, we started to dissect how much of that was going into technologies that are more at the farm and ranch level on through to the consumer-facing products. Of $19.8 billion in 2019, we found that $7.6 billion were more at the farm and ranch level, or a technology that a veterinarian might use, or an actual farmer and rancher. So the bulk of investment was more in further processing or consumer-facing products or innovations. So that was a first aha moment for us, that we had an opportunity to capture a greater share in the animal agriculture space of that total investment portfolio, and then especially of that 7.6 billion. However, then we also wanted to dissect that 7.6 billion and figure out how much of that was going towards crop agriculture versus animal agriculture. And according to the USDA Economic Research Service, animal agriculture and crop agriculture in the United States are equal in terms of gross receipts. So if we're comparing dollars to dollars, it would be a good sound reasoning to say that of that 7.6 billion, 50% should go towards crops and 50% should go towards animal agriculture, because again, in terms of gross receipts, they're equal economies. However, when we dissected that $7.6 billion, over 2/3 was flowing into crop agriculture. So that was a second aha moment for us, is not only do we have an opportunity to capture more of this 19.8 billion, but we have a significant opportunity to capture more of this $7.6 billion that was invested in 2019. Now, the third number that I asked you to recall is that greater than 51 billion. So if you fast forward to 2021, at the end of 2021, we could identify over $51 billion invested in the food and agri-tech space. So since 2019, venture capitalists' interest in food and agri-tech has exponentially increased. And again, it's an opportunity for for animal agriculture, to capture more of those dollars. However, I would propose, unfortunately, there's something we need to take into consideration. And I've borrowed this from a friend of mine in Australia who spoke at a recent conference out in California. He reminds us that in every good story, and really life is just a giant story that we're all unfolding, in every good story, there is a villain and there's a hero. And obviously, you always want to be the hero. But what I started to say a moment ago is, unfortunately, right now, the narrative that seems to be prolific is that animal agriculture is the villain, and alternative proteins, whether they're plant-based or cell-cultured or some other alternative protein, is the hero. And so we have to find a way to flip that story, to indicate and demonstrate that no, animal agriculture is also a hero in this story of life. And there's some things that we can look towards to achieve this. And one is innovation and technology, but we have to capture consumers' interest in innovation and technology. So a couple other data points I'll leave you with as I wrap up here. Gosh, over a decade ago, we identified that Google was actually better at predicting where flu outbreaks were going to be across the United States than local health officials or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Why is that? In today's culture or society, anytime we have a question or we want to know more about a topic, one of the first things we do is we go and we Google it, a noun that has now become a verb. Here's some Google Trends data. So on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 signifying little interest and 100 maximum interest, meat interest went from 24 in January of 2004 to 73 just a couple of months ago. Alternative proteins began at an 18 in 2004 and have grown to a 76 by 2022. So consumers have significant interest in both meat and alternative proteins. So we definitely have to be part of that conversation. Now, another number I asked you to remember was 90%, or 9 out of 10. In 2021, the top food and ag tech investments were in alternative protein companies. In fact, the 9 out of the 10 largest investments were in alternative proteins. And just in 2021, those 9 companies garnered more than $2.8 billion in venture capital investment. So as I wrap up, I mentioned that animal agriculture, or the National Institute for Animal Agriculture, we really like to help our sector of the food system set our strategy for going forward. Where do we need to pay attention? Where do we need to be engaging? How do we ensure that animal agriculture is that preferred provider of protein? So anytime we're doing a strategic planning process, we always go through a SWOT analysis, or we assess strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So based on our members and stakeholders' conversations over the last few years, I've done a quick SWOT analysis that I'll leave you with, but please, this is where I also see a great opportunity for conversation. So if I were to put 3 under each of these categories, I would say our strengths. We're a highly desired food, physically and mentally. There's a reason alternative protein companies want to call their products meat or dairy or eggs or poultry or fish. People not only physically, but mentally desire our products. We are a complete protein. Kim Kircher could talk about this much more than I could, in terms of there are several nutrients and vitamins and minerals, et cetera, that we can only get from animal-derived proteins in a complete package. And we have a rich global history. We've raised millions of people out of poverty. It's a cultural, it's a lifestyle, and a utilitarian need around the globe to have animal protein. Now, our weaknesses. In aggregate, sometimes we can be a late adopting industry. We will wait to see how things play out before we engage, and that can be to our detriment at times. We're highly segmented and fragmented. As I mentioned before, we traditionally talk about comparing one animal protein to another. I would propose in today's market, we need to talk more about how we compare to alternative proteins than another animal-derived protein. And we're slow to engage in emotional conversations. I won't go into this too much more because I know Amy has much more expertise in this space from the work that the Center for Food Integrity does. Opportunities, greater investment. We've already discussed the fact that we are not getting our share of the total dollars being invested in the food and agritech space. We have to continue to make sure we're giving consumers that permission to enjoy animal-derived proteins. We know they want them. They're having ethical concerns about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, and other factors that we have to give them permission to overcome. We have to have greater collaboration, especially on pre-competitive areas, whether that's around food safety, animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, environmental stewardship, and more. And then finally, those threats that we should be all watching that we don't control on a day-to-day basis, but are out there. Things like loss of social license and therefore our freedom to operate. Again, this is something that Amy and her colleagues at the Center for Food Integrity have done extensive work and research in. Climate change. I'm not here to debate whether something is causing or is not causing climate change, whether it's global warming, global cooling, something else. However, we do know that climate change is not only affecting animal agriculture, but like all parts of society, we have a role to play in climate change. So we need to be ready to adapt and engage there. And then finally, zoonotic diseases. It's estimated that each year, zoonotic diseases affect animal agriculture to the tune of over $220 billion. So this not only is a significant economic loss, but it's an animal welfare issue. It's a food security, a food safety issue in some cases that we need to make sure we're watching and staying on top of. So with that, I'm going to pause. Obviously, we would love to have all of your voices, your insights, your expertise in our conversations. So we would love to connect. You can find us on all the social media platforms, and there's my email. But with that, Casey, I will turn the virtual podium back over to you and look forward to the dialogue with you all and Amy momentarily. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, JJ. Now we can welcome Amy Church to the virtual stage to share her insights on this topic.
Good. Well, thank you, Casey and Animal Ag Alliance and all of you who have interest in this topic, and really appreciate the conversation that JJ has started, and agree that we have a lot of consistent findings when we're talking about public acceptance around animal proteins and the role of technology in our sustainable future. So if you're not familiar with the Center for Food Integrity, we are an organization that's about 15 years old with the same mission from day one, and that is to help today's food system to earn consumer trust. And among our nearly 150 different members and project partners at the Center for Food Integrity, it truly ranges from, as we'd say, farm to fork, and we pride ourselves on having a diverse group of stakeholders around the table. So certainly we know that U.S. agriculture is under the microscope as those in the food supply chain are looking to agriculture, farmers, and ranchers to help meet our very global sustainability and ESG goals. So innovation and proven technologies, we that are close to production agriculture, we know that those technologies are essential to creating enough safe, healthy, and affordable food while achieving those environmental and sustainability goals. So the question we have to answer, knowing some previous experience, is how do we earn acceptance for technology in agriculture? And that was exactly the question that we at CFI sought out to answer about a year ago. So specifically, what are the drivers of acceptance? and rejection of the technology that's being used in food and agriculture when we know that there's such broad adoption of technology in other areas of American culture. So to answer this question, CFI conducted research last summer, 2021, to identify those specific factors that drive consumer acceptance or rejection of technology. So the research was conducted through support from the United Soybean Board, and I'll share today our top line learnings with links to more details. Seriously, the full research report is 281 slides to be precise. I only pulled out about 10 of those, if that, to share with you today on a high level. The research and analysis is really designed to equip farmers, technology developers, and food producers with trust earning strategies. So then as new innovations are being developed and introduced and launched, we can utilize those strategies to help protect their social license, and so that those of us in animal agriculture can meet those ambitious goals around food security and environment. So in this work, the goal of CFI and the United Soybean Board was to develop a model that classifies existing and future technologies along key factors that are known to be associated with consumer acceptance. After reviewing some existing research, we tested a model that was initially presented in the June 2020 issue of Nature Food by Segrist and Hartman. And the core of that model is shown here. It draws upon a variety of factors, including perceptions of technology, consumer characteristics, and the mental shortcuts that are used in decision-making, or called heuristics. So these factors inform our perceived risk and the perceived benefits of adopting technology. Ultimately, for broad societal acceptance of a technology, the perceived benefits must outweigh or at least be equal to the perceived risks. So there's quite a bit to unpack here on this slide. So let's dive into the model shown in the boxes. So on the left, under technology aspects, you'll see 4 different factors that are believed to be significant drivers of acceptance or rejection. First, voluntary exposure. And that's one's need to know so that I can choose and make an informed decision about what I'm going to ingest into my body. Secondly, perceived naturalness. And this is related to my cultural norms, my perceptions of natural, which makes it really tricky. This also becomes more challenging with technology that's used in animals because of that deep emotional response that's triggered when we think about animals in our lives. Perceived dread is a big one. This is that gut level concern about those unknown future impacts. What are the unknown consequences? The public is much more sensitive to technology when it applies to food that we are ingesting. So technology that doesn't really directly impact food, like drones or precision farming, that's much less likely to trigger dread. And finally, in the technology, perceived control. So this empowers me to make a very conscious decision. It ties to that voluntary exposure we talked about and that control in choosing what I ingest. Under consumer characteristics, there's also been 4 key drivers identified. Disgust sensitivity is triggered by those extreme feelings of unnatural or just plain gross. So consider what comes to mind when we hear words like pink slime or frankenfood. Secondly, our general attitudes toward new technologies. In other areas of life, am I generally an innovator or an early adopter? Or am I slow to embrace technology? There's likely some carryover when I'm considering technology in agriculture and food. Cultural values, and that's really, is this what's right based on my values, my experience? And finally, personal identification. This ties into that tribe mentality that's sometimes discussed. Is this technology or use of this technology consistent with my self-image and how I want others to perceive me and my family? So as I said before, heuristics are those mental shortcuts in decision making, and they stand in for the detailed technical knowledge when making a decision. So if I don't completely understand the science or the technology, these are shortcuts I take to form a conclusion. So in this model, the heuristics that drive acceptance include those images that are positive or negative that are associated with the technology, a belief around natural is better, or the previous or current offerings are better than the technology being proposed. But most importantly, and really the foundation of this driver, is the trust heuristic. And that includes trust in people and organizations, as well as trust in the technology itself. So to open the door with consumers about technology, they must believe that the technology comes from trustworthy organizations who are acting and they have credible people that are championing and developing the technology. Secondly, the public, around this trust heuristic, the public must see that the benefits of the technology are aligned with our societal values, and those benefits then justify trusting the technology, outweighing any perceived risk. So perceived risks can definitely negatively impact, especially if they're around food safety, our personal health, the environment, and animals. Those areas really can carry more weight. Ultimately, for acceptance, the perceived benefits must outweigh or at least be equal to those perceived risks. So those internal benefits are extremely powerful. So this technology use can improve my health or the health of those that I love. It's improved nutrition that I'm choosing because nutrition equals health. There's also external benefits that can significantly improve our acceptance of technology, and they can be really compelling when they're tied to our own set of values, like producing enough food for all while conserving natural resources, or reducing animal suffering. So this 2021 research tested the importance of factors around 4 different technologies that are becoming known to consumers: gene editing in plants, gene editing in animals, plant-based meat alternatives, and cultured meat. So the research showed that the model is highly credible and highly predictive. So for those of you that are number crunchers, data analysts, or scientists in the crowd, the R-squared values ranged from 0.71 to a high of 0.84 for the 4 technologies that were tested. So in a minute, I'll share results from 2 of the technologies that we tested. But first, I'd like to check some consistent themes and hear from you in our first poll question. So this is, which age demographic has the most positive impression of technology used to grow food? And this is based on our specific research in 2021. So here we go, the results are in, and it looks like the majority chose Gen Z, and that's a very good choice. But our research in 2021, in every technology that we surveyed, showed that millennials actually have the most positive impression of technology used to grow food. But millennials and Gen Z were very close to that. So 2 good answers. Second question, another poll, is again in this research, what innovator category has the most positive impression of technology used to grow food? And these 5 categories are from the very familiar diffusion of innovations model by Rogers. And survey says the audience is right. It was indeed early adopters that significantly showed the most positive impression of technology used to grow food here in the US. And that fact is very helpful because as we deploy strategies to increase acceptance, early adopters are really the trusted sources. They're opinion leaders. Early adopters play a real key role in paving the way and influencing their peers for broader societal acceptance, whether it's new practices, new technologies, or ideas, a very influential group. And they have a very positive impression. So just a couple other level setting facts. as we get into the specific research, we asked survey respondents about their general impression about technology used to grow food in the US. And it's a great result. Nearly 2 in 3 have a very positive or somewhat positive impression. And 20%, or 1 in 5, have a very positive impression of technology used in food in the US today. Then we also asked questions about self-identified knowledge about technology use. So just over half of those in this survey believe they know a lot or at least a little bit about technology used to grow food, just over half. And 1 in 10 say they know a lot about the use of technologies. Not surprising with our poll results, but early adopters, millennials, and Gen Z are the most likely to believe that they know quite a bit about technology use. And just a couple more general facts about this group of consumers. We asked for general perceptions about US agriculture, and there's really some good news here in that nearly 2 out of 3 surveyed have a very positive or somewhat positive impression of US agriculture. So really good to see. And again, millennials and early adopters were among the most positive and believe that they're most knowledgeable about US agriculture. So next, as I promised, I'd like to review the very high-level survey findings around 2 of the 4 technologies that we tested. And that is gene editing in plants and gene editing in animals. So we've seen in previous work that there are some pretty significant differences in consumer reaction and acceptance between plant gene editing and animal gene editing. So we really wanted to better understand those differences. In the survey, we provided about 25 statements about each technology. And these were statements that were directly tied to this technology attributes and consumer characteristics in that model I shared a few slides ago. So then we analyzed the consumer responses to understand the elements that are most related to positive perception and acceptance of gene editing in plants. So the top tier driver, the number 1 thing, was eating food containing gene edited plants is safe for consumers. That's followed by a couple second tier drivers. Gene editing of plants promotes greater sustainability of food production through higher crop yields. I think it's pretty fascinating the way that this statement read, in that we're talking about the buzzword of sustainability that we know is so important, but we're also acknowledging that it takes higher productivity to help in that improved sustainability. The second tier driver was confidence in the techniques because they're used in human medicine. Then there was a set of what we call third tier drivers. They're also influential, not as quite as much as the others I described, but technology to edit the genes of plants is available to all farmers and growers. You know, there's an equity and fairness of use. Next, that information is available so consumers can know when they are purchasing food that was produced from gene-edited plants. And then the third in this list actually has a negative impact. Everything else we've talked about, that's a very positive impact in acceptance. But that with a negative impact is a statement like, naturally grown plants are better than plants that have been gene edited. And so speaking to that desire for naturalness over technology among a certain segment of consumers. So while there's that negative impact around natural is better, the top 5 are all positive drivers. And those are ones for which the ag industry and technology developers can promote positive messages and implement some strategies around engagement and outreach that can really help to propel those acceptance drivers. Then the second set here are the drivers of trust in technology of gene editing in animals. So again, we developed 25 very specific statements that are tied to those acceptance factors in the model. The top tier driver probably looks pretty familiar. Eating food from animals that have been gene editing is safe. a second-tier driver, gene editing of food production animals is a beneficial farming practice because it can help ensure a consistent supply of food. So thinking about the timing of this research, it was in last summer, 2021. And I wonder if some of having come through the pandemic and supply chain issues at that point was triggering questions around supply. We know that's certainly a headline driver in today's world. Then there were also 3 third-tier drivers around gene editing of animals. First, that information on food produced from gene-edited animals is readily available. We saw that in the plant analysis as well. Confidence in the techniques because it's used in human medicine, also repeating from the plants. And a third driver, also with a negative impact, is a belief that biotech companies are only motivated by profit. And we know from years of historical research, when the public believes that motivations are profit-based, they wonder if their own personal benefits or safety or quality of the product may be compromised in the name of profit. So knowing these drivers, whether they are negative or positive, really gives animal agriculture this foundation to develop strategies, engagement, and messages that are more likely to increase public acceptance of gene editing in animals. And here, I'm not going to, due to time, I'm not going to go into all the detail on this slide, but I want you to know that for each of the 4 technologies that we measured, we have a wealth of information that allows us to better understand the perceptions and the perceptions by different consumer segments. So there can really be some targeted strategies. From all of this information, we can develop those effective messages and strategies those will assist the ag tech companies, farmers, producer-funded organizations, and others as we're collectively working to develop, research, launch, and utilize new technologies in the fields and in the barns. So my third and final poll question here is, what factor was a top-tier driver for consumer acceptance in all 4 technologies that CFI tested? And I know I only shared 2 so far. I'll certainly acknowledge this one is quite tricky, so I'm curious to see your impression. But again, the majority here, the number 1 vote getter, was correct. Food derived is safe for humans to eat. You saw that in gene editing in plants and animals. We also saw that as the top driver around plant-based meats and cultivated meats. But again, I said this was a tricky question. All 4 of these options showed up as a leading driver, a second-tier driver, and at least 2, if not 3 of the technologies. So I would say collectively, they all are important to address. So in summary, this 2021 consumer research confirmed results that we've really seen in other studies by CFI and others across food and agriculture. The foundation for acceptance is readily access to information and positive attributes, promotion of the benefits. We really need to emphasize that that end product is based on nature, when that's true, and safe for consumers to ingest. So in the absence of a specific understanding and knowledge around the technical details, buyers often take shortcuts in decision-making. So that really what's key to public trust when we're making those mental shortcuts is trusting the organizations that develop technologies and those organizations that approve and monitor the impact of technologies. So thinking like regulatory agencies and others that are watching impacts. Ultimately, for acceptance, the benefits of the technology, and those are benefits as they're perceived by society and by individuals, those benefits must outweigh the perceived risks of ingesting food that's been derived through technology. Those perceived benefits simply must resonate with the public and outweigh potential risk. So those of us in production agriculture, we certainly know that farmers, industry, researchers, scientists are continually finding new ways to use innovation and produce crops and animal proteins that are increasingly sustainable. And there's a great story to tell around that. Based on all that we know and continue to learn about consumer motivations, I believe that when we transparently present the societal benefits, the safety of food, the responsible use, then we help consumers appreciate this great value and the potential that agriculture brings to achieve those sustainability and food security goals. So this was certainly a quick and high-level review of our findings on this topic. I do invite you to learn more. Please, I'd welcome any specific personal emails for more specific information. You can also watch a more detailed webinar on the foodintegrity.org website. Additionally, the next phase of this work is that we are completing some research that's complementary, and it's specific to understanding acceptance drivers and rejection factors among food companies and food industry stakeholders. So we're going to be real public with those findings and some recommendations, as well as a series of tools that will come from that. Expect those to be coming in the later summer. And we hope that they have great application for those in food and agriculture to use and to build trust in ag technology. So with that, I really thank you for your interest. I see a few questions have come up in the Q&A and look forward to our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy and JJ, for that great discussion and those insights on consumer acceptance and innovation and technology. Let's kick off the Q&A. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A box. The first one looks like it is for JJ. So how are venture capitalists defining sustainability?
Sure. So, and I borrowed this from somebody years ago, sustainability is still a lot like the definition of beauty. It's different to everyone. And so that's why it's important to engage with various audiences to better understand what their definition is. What I will say, though, too, is that we are seeing a shift in more organizations, venture capitalist firms included, looking at the entire picture of sustainability. So several years ago, I would have said the number one driver was environmental sustainability. So looking at whether it be greenhouse gas emissions, water use, overall land use, et cetera. That tended to be how they first defined sustainability. But probably in the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen more and more organizations, again, venture capitalists included, looking at, obviously, yes, still environmental sustainability, but more social factors like animal welfare, worker health and safety, overall societal benefits like food safety, et cetera. And then, of course, they're looking at the sustainability of the business from an economic standpoint. So as long as you have those three, economic, environment, and social, in the definition somewhere, you're going to capture their definition, I would say, from a broad brush perspective. It's then the nuances to determine, are there specific aspects of each of those areas that they are really focused on. For example, I can think of one venture capital firm. When you talk about societal sustainability, their number one driver is animal welfare as they look at investee type companies or organizations. So that would be the broad answer to sustainability. It's still very much environmental, economic, and social.
And the next question I have, it looks like it's for Amy. So has anyone done research on all kinds of ag tech and innovation? The things like using an app to monitor animals, or the computer-based stuff that gamers and people who live on their smartphones would be excited about?
Yeah, Kim, that is a great question. And in fact, that wasn't a gap that we had identified a couple of years ago when we were forming this work with the United Soybean Board. And so because we were not able to find any research that really cut across different technologies to find those consistent acceptance and rejection factors. There's been a lot of consumer research around very specific technologies and practices, but nothing that really put those on kind of an apples to apples comparative basis. So I agree with the observation that you included there in the Q&A, that for a couple of different reasons. And that observation was, so the apps that we're using to monitor animals, and all the precision animal ag and monitoring. So would that be interesting to consumers who are used to gaming, et cetera? I think that's a great observation for a couple of different reasons. That definitely resonates with those millennials, Gen Z. I'm thinking of my two college kids who haven't known life without a smartphone, right? And then that also has a higher likelihood for acceptance of use in that cool factor, and also in the fact that using those monitoring systems, just like drones or GPS or other technologies in precision agriculture, that doesn't have as much of a fear factor in terms of ingestion, because it's quite a ways from the actual end product. So I think those are great technologies. We see that a lot in folks talking about Fitbits for cows and all those other really cool monitoring applications.
And then the next question looks like it's also for Amy. So this attendee has questions about gene editing being tested on the consumer research. So does it actually put concern into people's heads when they are asked questions if they're not concerned about it to begin with? He's just thinking if this is something posed that they hadn't thought about earlier, it could perhaps cause extra attention on that particular topic.
Yeah, it's a great question to consider. And I think something that experts in research work to do really well is to not influence the consumer answers. So that statement, I'd have to look back to see exactly how the statements around were worded, but they were likely worded something like, I have questions about this, I'm curious about. So we try to use really non-inflammatory words, and then the rating that the respondents give is kind of on a scale of 1 to 5 or such. So then we're understanding the level of concern. So again, working really hard to not influence or draw attention to concerns. I would say that specifically in the elevated questions around gene editing in animals, we saw that in this research, and it's been pretty consistent in at least 5 different other studies, either published or proprietary, that I'm aware of. So it's a consistent theme across different research.
And then the last attendee question I have, I think it could go to either of you. So how do we combat the social stigma of animal raising for food versus the new embracing of USA produced animal waste or affordable fertilizer with the Russia sanctions?
So, and I can kick it off, but I imagine Amy and I would have very similar responses in terms of, I think first and foremost, what research by the Center for Food Integrity and others within this space continuously finds is that we as consumers, as shoppers, as eaters, we're first concerned about ourselves and our loved ones. So food safety, effects on diet, health, and nutrition seem to always rise to the top. So anytime we're engaging around animal agriculture conversations, if we lead with the fact that we're producing a safe, affordable, nutritious food source, that begins to resonate. And then secondly, though, and this is even underscored in the animal agriculture space, then that the secondary areas we focus on are those areas like animal welfare, worker health and safety, farm family profitability, et cetera, or, rural community viability. So we do have an interesting conversation to have. The other thing, though, is, and this is where I'm going to steal Amy's thunder by saying we have to lead with our values, because we are going to find there are people who their personal values are we shouldn't use animals for protein or fiber. And now we can have a conversation about how they arrived at that value. But traditionally, you don't change someone's values if they're deeply held. And so asking questions, engaging with them in a true conversation and not just talking at them about animal agriculture, I think is how we overcome those barriers, if you will. And also it's a way to maybe exit that damned if you do, damned if you don't type scenario, because if we find that their values are just so starkly different than ours, then we can, for lack of a better way of saying it, agree to disagree and move on to something that's more productive in terms of a conversation. But if we do find that maybe they've come to some conclusions based on ill-informed information or old information or then we can start to really have that values-based conversation about why we feel animals are part of a healthy, sustainable world and food system. Amy, how did I steal too much of your thunder? How'd I do?
No, I would say ditto to everything that JJ said. And it really just makes me further believe that now is the time for us to really be loud and proud in U.S. agriculture about the productivity gains that we've had and the number of individuals that, one farmer is able to feed. And we need to, I know we've been cautious about talking about productivity, but when we do it in a way that it's framed up as part of the improved sustainability story, then there's very good response to that. It's an effective message when we're saying that because of the use of innovation and better management practices and research and because of this, farmers are able to now make more pounds of meat with less natural resources, using less land, using less water. Every sector, I think, has the facts that prove that. And it's definitely true in the row crop world, which of course greatly influences our carbon footprint in animal agriculture with feed consumption. So loud and proud about our productivity gains and just the will of the American farmer and American agriculture to be able to serve not only the US food needs, but those around the world.
And if I may too, to dovetail, what I hear when Amy talks about speaking up loud and proud is also being proactive in the conversations. And this relates a little bit to the previous question around oftentimes and I include myself in this as someone who's been involved in animal agriculture, like many on this webinar for my entire life, we're reactive as intensive instead of proactive. And there's times for both, don't get me wrong, but oftentimes, especially in a communications or an engagement standpoint, being reactive can take a lot more resources, whether that's time, staff, dollars, etc. But as opposed to if we can be more proactive in setting the tone of a conversation or engaging with those early adopters or those individuals who are going to be leading conversations about technology and innovation in animal agriculture, the case studies would demonstrate it's going to behoove us. So my translation of loud and proud is also be proactive in conversations.
Thank you both.
And not only that tendency to be reactive, we also have the tendency to be very humble and quiet about our achievements.
Well, thank you both. My final question for both of you, and you both kind of hit on it a little bit already with being loud and proud and being proactive, is what is your one key action item you want the attendees to take away from this presentation, this discussion today? I'll start with JJ.
I would say the biggest action item I have is if we're going to garner a greater percentage of the dollars and the other resources flowing into the food and agri-tech space, we being animal agriculture, we have to find ways to disrupt ourselves. What are those old technologies, those old production practices and ways of raising livestock or animals that we need to shift or we need to explore? So disrupt ourselves.
And Amy?
Yeah, I would say we need to acknowledge that the transparency and accessibility of information when technology is being used at whatever point of the production chain, that ability to access information that consumers are in the know and they're making a voluntary choice that's really critical. And we can think of other technologies where that hasn't happened or happened too late, and there's really a knee-jerk and negative reaction. So I think, and definitely our strategies around working with millennials, Gen Z, and the early adopters to help to drive that acceptance, because they're liking what we're doing in agriculture. They're liking what they know about us, and really positive about how technology can be a solution. So how can they extend that message to their peers and to other consumer segments?
Great. Thank you both so much for being here for our final pre-summit webinar before we kick things off next week in Kansas City. If any of you would like to connect further with JJ or Amy, please feel free to send them a message in our Summit app.